My name is Josie Luetke. I'm one of the youth coordinators at Campaign Life Coalition. The webinar that I'll be doing today is on euthanasia. When is life no longer worth living? I have to say at the outset that I'm admittedly much more knowledgeable on the abortion issue. That does not mean that I'm ignorant on the euthanasia issue and still think that I have something to share with you all. I have researched the issue since 2014 at least, and kept abreast of what's going on nationwide, especially legally. That said, I want to make it clear that there are experts with more knowledge than myself. So without further ado, the overview. First, we'll be defining our terms, which is super important, and it'll become apparent why. Then we'll be reviewing the history of euthanasia and assisted suicide in Canada very briefly. I'll be explaining the current law and how Bill C7 would seek to change it. I will be defending the pro-life position on this topic, and then I'll be leaving you guys with some action items. So to start, there is a distinction between assisted suicide and euthanasia. Assisted suicide is when you provide someone the means with which to take their own life or otherwise assist them in committing suicide. So in the case of what we're talking about today, that'll typically mean a physician or a nurse practitioner giving someone lethal drugs, and then it's up to them to choose whether to take it or not. Euthanasia, meanwhile, is when an individual directly kills someone else, typically through, let's say, lethal injection. So instead of helping someone kill themselves, you're directly responsible for the killing. And there's three different types of euthanasia. There's voluntary, non-voluntary, and involuntary euthanasia. Voluntary, obviously, is when the patient requests it, seemingly wants to be euthanized. Non-voluntary would be where the patient doesn't have the ability to express their will when it comes to this issue. For instance, if they're in a coma or a persistent vegetative state, they might not be able to express whether they want euthanasia or not. Involuntary euthanasia would be where a patient does express that they don't want euthanasia, and yet they're euthanized anyway. Generally speaking, like, only voluntary euthanasia or assisted suicide is permitted now, but we'll talk about how that might not always be the case here in Canada. There's also a distinction between passive and active euthanasia. Active euthanasia, again, involves you doing something to cause the person's death, whereas passive euthanasia would be an omission that causes the patient's death, i.e. you're withholding something. It could be food and water, which we would view as wrong. These are the basic necessities of life. And so if you were withholding that, you might be passively committing euthanasia, but we'd still view that as wrong. Passive euthanasia can also sometimes be defined to include withholding treatment, other treatment besides basic necessities like food and water, or let's say taking someone off life support. But that's contentious whether that should actually be considered passive euthanasia or not. So you might be wondering, what about MAID, or medical assistance, or aid in dying? Because this is probably the most common term you actually hear nowadays when talking about euthanasia and assisted suicide. And I hate this term so much. First of all, it's really vague because I want medical aid in dying. When I'm dying, I would like medical practitioners to aid me, provide me some pain relief, perhaps, make my last days comfortable. That would be nice. So it's such a broad term. Even though we all know now that they're referring to euthanasia, assisted suicide, that aid and assistance is killing you. But just surface level, again, it's such bad wording. And it doesn't actually distinguish between assisted suicide and euthanasia at all. And I think that is a nice distinction to have, to know whether, again, you're helping someone kill themselves or directly killing them or not. It's just a broad term for both of these concepts. And also, I'm a philosophy major. I probably say that about as often as a vegetarian will say I'm a vegetarian. But in philosophy, the distinction between killing versus like letting die is hugely important. And even the people who want to claim that, there actually isn't an ethical distinction here, like it's a subject of debate at least. And proponents of euthanasia and assisted suicide always want to blur the line between killing versus letting die. Because to an extent, we do already let die quite a bit. And I'll go into that later. But it is, in our perspective, definitely crossing into a different territory when we're actively killing someone or helping someone kill themselves. And medical assistance aid in dying completely blurs that distinction. Also, especially if Bill C-7 passes, patients who aren't dying will be permitted to be killed. To an extent, that could be happening now because the requirement that one's death be reasonably foreseeable is interpreted so broadly that, anyway, I'll get into that. But we're still going to be using the term medical assistance or aid in dying when someone isn't dying. So again, hugely problematic phrase. I reject it. I want you to reject it as well. And what's really interesting is that Death with Dignity, it's one of the groups in the US advocating for assisted suicide and euthanasia. The main group in Canada is Dying with Dignity. You'll notice a theme here. And you can see in their recommended value-neutral language, quote unquote, there's a theme, again, dying, death, dying, 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 dying. And also, like, dying with dignity, death with dignity is so insulting because it's implying that people who have natural deaths are not always dignified. And that's not the case, because as human beings, we know that our dignity is inherent. It doesn't matter if you're in diapers. It doesn't matter if you need someone to spoon feed you. Guess what? You're still dignified. That doesn't make you undignified. So again, hugely insulting, but language is so important in this debate. So it's really interesting to see what they're advocating for here. And also, they claim that suicide is politicized language deployed with the intent of reducing support for the issue. It implies a value judgment and carries with it a social stigma. I mean, that might be a little bit true, but just I've taken a screenshot of the top definitions of suicide here. And you'll see the act of intentionally causing one's own death, the act or an instance of taking one's own life voluntarily and intentionally, the intentional taking of one's own life. Like, I think that's what we're talking about here. With assisted suicide, at least, there's also, you might have heard the term physician-assisted suicide. One of the individuals they quote said, "All I am asking for is to have some choice over how I die. Portraying me as suicidal is disrespectful and hurtful to me and my loved ones." And I get that. And yet, if, for instance, someone was dying and they decided, you know what, this process to getting euthanasia and assisted suicide is taking too long, like, I'm going to, like, my pain is too much. I don't really want to die, but I can't bear it any longer, and decides to jump off a bridge. Like, we would say that they committed suicide, even if they were already dying, even if they didn't really want to die, they just wanted to relieve their pain. I mean, that's an accurate term there. They committed suicide, and so when someone helps them do that, it's assisted suicide. They don't like the term because it's accurately portraying what's happening here. Anyway, What is not euthanasia? Providing pain relief to a patient, even whilst knowing there's a possibility that doing so may cause the patient to die sooner. So especially if the patient is experiencing a great deal of pain, they might need some serious painkillers. We wouldn't consider that euthanasia, even if that painkiller has the potential of shortening someone's life, because the intention there is not to shorten the patient's life, but rather to relieve the pain. And if the person ends up living days and days and days more than expected, that's great. It's wonderful. Refusing treatment considered to be too burdensome would also not be considered euthanasia. So, you know, if you've undergone some rounds of chemo and you find out your cancer's back and you're like, you know what, I don't want to do chemo anymore. Like, I'm ready to go and meet my maker. That's not euthanasia either. Or for patients on life support, that there's a difference there between extraordinary versus ordinary care or measures being taken. Again, as I established before, food and water, ordinary care. We all need that in order to live. But something like life support, if you take a patient off it and it turns out that they're breathing on their own and they're fine, again, it was never our intent to kill the patient then, but rather we don't have to prolong life at all costs. That's not the pro-life position. We're not like delay death. Like, it's not that. We don't accept that we're one day going to die. Of course, that's going to happen. It's a natural process of life that it eventually comes to an end. We're opposed to killing, obviously, but again, that doesn't mean you have to like go through every hoop, jump over every hurdle in order to try to like extend life. Again, even if you can do all that and also not be successful. So that's not our position here. Our position is against killing. So to provide a brief history of euthanasia and assisted suicide in Canada, I suppose I could go back further than 1993, but I think this is the big case that people will think back to, that really ignited the debate. Rodriguez v. British Columbia. Sue Rodriguez had ALS, and her case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they ruled 5-4 against Sue Rodriguez, so they didn't strike down the law at the time, though it was very close. But since that point in time, there were many legislative initiatives which attempted to legalize assisted suicide and euthanasia. And that continued over the next couple of decades. But all of them were unsuccessful, except for Quebec's Bill 52 in 2014. And I'll have to mention that all of these legislative initiatives, like, they were mainly federal initiatives, bills or motions. But this one was a provincial bill. And the Criminal Code of Canada is under federal jurisdiction, but the way that the Quebec government kind of got around it was by defining, they didn't actually use the terms assisted suicide and euthanasia, but again, medical aid in dying, as being part of healthcare, which is under provincial jurisdiction. And so Bill 52, I guess, is fairly similar to Bill C-14, which we'll talk about. Did require that a patient be at the end of their life if they were to receive euthanasia or assisted suicide. But so that's always been Quebec. They've always been pushing the agenda on social issues, and so by doing that, it definitely increased the conversation on the topic. And it seemed like it was only a matter of time before Canada would be permitting this nationwide. And indeed, in 2015, Carter v. Canada struck down the prohibition on assisted suicide and euthanasia. And this is another case of judicial activism. If you heard my last webinar, you'll know I'm pretty salty about that. Because the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms didn't change between 1993 and 2015, but somehow they came to a radically different conclusion in 2015. How about that? And so what's interesting about Carter v. Canada is that they didn't include a requirement that death be reasonably foreseeable in that decision. But when they gave Parliament time to draft a law, and the Liberals came up with Bill C-14, and that bill did have the requirement that death be reasonably foreseeable. And we'll talk about the specific requirements included within it. But again, they won. They indicated that in 5 years they'll review the law. And so there was the belief, rightly, that when they review the law, they'll be looking to expand it further. But also that there was this sense that it's just going to get worse still. And it did. Again, another court case, Truchon, the Attorney General of Canada, a Quebec case, of course. In 2019, the justice ruled that it was unconstitutional to require that death be reasonably foreseeable before someone is granted euthanasia or assisted suicide. And so the federal government had the opportunity to appeal this decision, but they chose not to. And instead, they came up with Bill C-7. But I'll have to point out that since Bill C-14 passed in June of 2016, up until the end of 2019, there were 13,946 cases of euthanasia or assisted suicide in Canada, and we see that number increasing. So that's over a 3.5-year period. But we see the number of cases increasing on a yearly basis as well. So that brings us to today, 2020, when we have Bill C-14 that is currently making its way through the legislative process, and we may very well see pass by the end of this year, though hopefully we don't if we are able to lobby our MPs, which I will talk about more at the end of the presentation. But first, this is from the government website. Our current legal restrictions, thanks to Bill C-14, who is eligible for medical assistance in dying. So you must meet all of the following criteria. You must, generally speaking, be from Canada. So some other countries actually allow people to fly in to receive euthanasia or assisted suicide. Not the case here in Canada yet. Currently, you have to be 18 years of age or older and mentally competent. We'll see how that changes in the future. You must have a grievous and irremediable medical condition, and we'll talk about what that means in just a couple of minutes. You have to make a voluntary request for euthanasia or assisted suicide. Again, we'll see if that's still the case with Bill C-7. And you must give informed consent. Again, I will elaborate. So, grievous and irremediable medical condition is defined as 1, having a serious illness, disease, or disability, and being in an advanced state of decline that cannot be reversed. You also have to experience unbearable physical or mental suffering that cannot be relieved under conditions that you consider acceptable. So, I mean, conceivably, you could be like, no, I don't consider it acceptable to anything offered you. And then you have to be at the point where your natural death has become reasonably foreseeable. Again, that is a super vague term. Like, to an extent, all of our deaths are reasonably foreseeable, like hopefully far into the future. But like already in just the few years since the bill passed, like it's already been interpreted so broadly. As you can see from the Canadian government, you do not need to have a fatal or terminal condition to be eligible for medical assistance in dying. So, I mean, I don't think that the term was ever intended to last very long. And you also must give informed consent, which means that you need information to make that decision, including your medical diagnosis, available forms of treatment, available options to relieve suffering, including palliative care. And I wanted to include this because actually palliative care is not always available. Like potentially over 2/3 of Canadians who could benefit from palliative care don't have access to it. So how can someone really give informed consent if they don't actually have all available options to relieve suffering? Which I will elaborate on. You must also give informed consent at both the time of your request and immediately before medical assistance in dying is provided. That is no longer going to remain in effect if Bill C7 is passed, and you can see here you can withdraw your consent at any time and in any manner. Again, we'll see how Bill C7 impacts that. So, Bill C7 does a lot, and I've listed a summary here. It's not meant to be super comprehensive. First of all, it would permit those whose deaths are not reasonably foreseeable to be euthanized. So they still have to have a grievous and irremediable medical condition, which again was defined by being in an irreversible state of decline, having intolerable psychological or physical suffering. How you quantify that, again, super subjective, but you don't have to even pretend that your natural death is reasonably foreseeable anymore. Who knows? You could have decades left, whatever, fine. I say generally after a 3-month period because if it looks like your ability to consent, like you've gone through all of the steps necessary, but it looks like your ability to consent is going to disappear before the 3 months, then it could be even shorter, which is crazy. Again, who knows how long a life this individual has? Who knows what potential cures could be developed in that time, which would make their suffering tolerable or eliminate it completely. But 3 months, which go by in a blink of time, or whatever the phrase is for me at least, could be the time it takes for a government to decide, yeah, your life is not worth living anymore. Request granted. The other thing Bill C7 would do is permit those whose deaths are reasonably foreseeable to be euthanized the day they make the request. Super problematic. I will talk about why. But anyway, that means exactly what it says, that they can request euthanasia and receive it on that very same day. There's no waiting period required. Previously under Bill C14, I guess currently under Bill C14, you're supposed to have a 10-day waiting period. Again, there are exceptions to that, but again, they don't even pretend that matters anymore. Same day, fine. Bill C7 would also permit incompetent people whose deaths are reasonably foreseeable to be euthanized if they previously requested it. So if they make all the arrangements with their physician or whomever, like these are the terms under which I want to be euthanized, and then they lose that capacity to consent, they can still be euthanized, which is worrisome because what if they change their mind in the in-between time? The bill would permit incompetent people to be euthanized if they, quote, lost the capacity to consent to it as a result of the self-administration of a substance that was provided to them under the provisions governing medical assistance in dying, unquote. Well, what does that mean? It means that, let's say that they do take some lethal drugs, but turns out they're not so lethal, and for whatever reason it doesn't kill them. Well, the physician could be like, well, they were intending to kill themselves and it didn't work, it failed. but don't worry, we'll finish the job. So, it's good to know that even if it fails, don't worry, the physicians have your back. The bill claims to protect individuals with a mental illness, i.e., that cannot be your sole reason for seeking assisted suicide or euthanasia. For instance, if you have cancer and depression, like, that's fine, but if you just have depression, according to the bill, that wouldn't be sufficient. But that's not entirely the case, because now that they've got rid of the requirement that death be reasonably foreseeable, then you could have someone who has a mental illness which does cause them psychological suffering, because that was included in the original law in Bill C-14. And not just physical suffering, psychological suffering too, which obviously mental illness causes. So it's not at all clear that they actually do, like, there is actually protection for individuals with mental illness. None at all, which is, again, really worrisome, because mental illness definitely increases, your risks of being suicidal. And it's not necessarily a permanent thing either when you have a mental illness. It could just be that they need the right drug combo or whatever to relieve your suffering. Bill C-7 is also ripe for a charter challenge. Alex Schattenberg of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition has talked about this a lot, but what it does is that it creates a two-tier system. So those whose deaths aren't reasonably foreseeable, they generally have to wait 3 months, whereas those whose deaths are reasonably foreseeable don't have to wait at all. So this two-tier system is generally considered unacceptable in Canada's healthcare system, that there's an inequality here. So someone could challenge it on that basis, and we could end up with a situation where even if you aren't in the process of dying, you can also request euthanasia and receive it on the very same day you request it. And Bill C-7 removes other safeguards, things like who can serve as a witness, how many witnesses are required, etc. So could Bill C-7 permit, sorry about that, involuntary euthanasia? I took these quotations from the text of the bill directly. So if someone requests euthanasia and they set out the parameters under which they want it, and then they lose their capacity to consent, they become incompetent, the physician can choose, or not choose, they are required, if they came into an agreement with the patient, to carry out the procedure now. But they're not supposed to do it if the person demonstrates by words, sounds, or gestures refusal to have the substance administered, or anyway resistance to its administration. So theoretically, if the patient no longer seems to want to be euthanized, the physician is supposed to stop. But if those words, sounds, or gestures that the patient makes now are deemed to be involuntary, like, oh, she just waved her arms because I touched her shoulder or something like that, then whatever, go ahead with the euthanasia. So again, these are the problems that come up with the changes in the law. If you make an advanced request for euthanasia for, like, when I become incompetent, I still want it, you could potentially lose the right to change your mind, because if you do change your mind, then any ways you attempt to communicate that could just be deemed involuntary then. I'm not saying that that will happen in all cases, or even some cases, though it may, but rather that it could happen. And these are the problems that the law should foresee and they should care about. But you'll notice with Bill C-7, the idea of erring on the side of caution does not mean erring on the side of giving the individual life. It means erring on the side of giving the individual death. If there's any chance that this individual ever wanted euthanasia, could want euthanasia, we'll euthanize them. That's that's the default position with this bill, which is very disturbing. In addition, it's really important to understand that the will to live fluctuates. So this is a paper from 2006, Dying Dignity in New Horizons in Palliative End-of-Life Care, and they have a section on will to live. And they mention one study of 200 terminally ill patients in a palliative care facility, and 44.5% acknowledged at least a fleeting desire to die. So it's common. But in most instances, these episodes were brief and did not reflect a sustained or committed desire to die. So 8.5% had that sustained desire. So that's less than 1 in 10. So when we think about letting someone be euthanized on the same day they request it, what if they're just having a bad day? Or again, what if someone requests euthanasia, like down the line, but again, are just having a bad day, and then the next day they change their mind or whatever, but at that point, they're deemed incompetent, no longer able to consent. They try to communicate that, but their flailings are just deemed involuntary movements. There's no recourse here. It's too late. They're dead now. They can't change their mind. Also, 59% of those who had that sustained desire to die were depressed. And of course, it's kind of incompatible, or at least hard, to have a will to live when you're depressed. And again, this is something that can and should be treated. There's another study as well with 168 terminally ill cancer patients. Again, they found that the will to live, measured twice daily, fluctuated rapidly, even over very brief time intervals. And they found out that this fluctuation can be accounted for, one, depression being one of those factors, which again can be treated, but also it could be something like moving from community living to inpatient palliative care. That would cause anxiety, and that impacts the will to live. So you have someone who moves from their home to a palliative care center, and they have like one upsetting day where they're getting used to these changes, and they're like, no, I don't think I can do this. I want to be euthanized. They can be euthanized that day. And then also, as death draws near, physical symptom distress can also impact will to live. And then again, only 3% demonstrate a consistent low will to live. So again, it just takes one bad day if you're at the end of your life, and you can be killed, and too late, can't change your mind. And I spent so much time on this because I just want to emphasize like how much our government doesn't care. Okay. So Alex Schadenberg, the executive director of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, said that Bill C-7, a bill to amend Canada's euthanasia law, if passed without amendments, will make Canada's euthanasia law the most permissive in the world. So if you know anything about our status quo on abortion, we have no protection for the preborn whatsoever, which is a distinction that we share with North Korea. And soon we could also have the same distinction when it comes to euthanasia. The very best. And you might think, like, of course he's going to say that. He's the director of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. But when I was preparing for this webinar over the past month, a professor at my alma mater, professor of political science, tweeted this, and he is for euthanasia and assisted suicide, but he calls Bill C-7 quote unquote a hot mess. He points out that it's overly complex, that again it creates different regimes for people whose deaths are reasonably foreseeable and not, that it's raising constitutional questions, controversial questions about advanced directives. He's complaining about the bill not yet permitting mature minors, i.e. those under 18, from receiving euthanasia. But that 5-year review that I mentioned that was supposed to take place starting this June, that review could still find that mature minors should be allowed to be euthanized. And in fact, Sick Kids in Toronto has already started preparing for that possibility. That, reassures you at all. I'm joking. Anyway, so Bill C-7 is bad, and not just in the eyes of pro-lifers either. And I would highly encourage you to look into the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition and Alex Schattenberg's blog, linked to here, because they've done a lot of work highlighting the problems with Bill C-7. And Alex Schattenberg is also probably like the foremost expert on euthanasia in the world, so he knows what happens when euthanasia is legalized in the Netherlands, Belgium, various United States, like individual states. So he can talk about the abuses that can happen without any oversight. But I'm sure you all want to know, what's the pro-life position here? So if you have listened to my webinar on abortion, you'll know that I propose it's wrong to kill innocent human beings. Abortion kills innocent human beings, therefore abortion is wrong. Well, guess what? That same argument can apply to the euthanasia issue. It is still wrong to kill innocent human beings, which euthanasia does, so therefore euthanasia is wrong. And again, this is what's called a syllogism in philosophy. So if you accept the first two premises, you have to accept the conclusion as well. Now, I don't think anyone is going to object to the second premise that euthanasia kills innocent human beings. I mean, I guess they're not necessarily all innocent, but anyway. So really the main objection is going to come with the first premise, that it's wrong to kill innocent human beings. And they might say it's generally wrong to kill innocent human beings, except if that human being is suffering greatly. So does suffering excuse euthanasia? So I'd like to introduce Herbert. Let's say that Herbert is suffering immensely, and he believes he has exhausted all alternatives to relieve that suffering. He's tried various treatments over the years, and he no longer wants to live. His suffering significantly impacts his day-to-day life. He doesn't have one day where he isn't impacted by his suffering. And his family members hate to see him suffering, and their own lives are significantly impacted by his suffering. You can imagine that someone who doesn't already have a pro-life stance might be compelled by this. Like, this is a pretty sorry case here. I feel bad for Herbert. Well, let me introduce an important factor. You might be thinking of Herbert as like an 80-year-old man in a nursing home, because I don't really know any Herberts that are not 80-year-old men. But let's say Herbert is actually a 17-year-old teenager who doesn't have a physical illness but has a mental illness. And I say this because people can be suffering greatly for all sorts of reasons. You can have able-bodied people like myself who are suffering immensely. And yet society says, no, your life is valuable. Herbert, don't kill yourself. There are posters in our subway system with signs that say, don't jump or whatever. Our government invests millions into marketing and hotlines, etc., to dissuade certain valuable, able-bodied young people not to give up, despite what could be their immense suffering. But we know that in those cases that we still want to fight for life here, that no, it's not okay to kill this innocent person just because they're suffering greatly. And so that same principle should apply even if we're talking about someone who is not able-bodied but has a disability or has a grievous and irremediable medical condition or is at the end of their life. Now, of course, some people might hear this scenario and be like, you know what, Herbert, the 17-year-old, he should be allowed to be euthanized, which is not my intention in bringing up the example, But if they were to say that, then I can respond, okay, let's say that his suffering is not significant. Let's say it's moderate. It's an inconvenience. And you know what? He doesn't think it's worth it anymore to keep on trying to live. At that point, do we say it's okay for him to be euthanized? What if his suffering is only minor, but he's like, still not worth it? These are just arbitrary distinctions here. How far will they go? And so when you are having a conversation with someone, I would recommend, I don't mean to be crass here, but trotting out the quote-unquote mentally ill teen. And I say that because our strategy with abortion is to trot out the toddler, because genuinely our intuitions are right with that case. And we can use that case to prove that things like suffering are not an excuse to kill someone. This is a quote from Brian Pollard, and he points out that compassion is derived from Latin and means to suffer with, and in the context of dying persons, it translates as walking the rest of life's journey beside them, seeking their comfort at every stage. And I think that's beautiful. So, I mean, that's compassion is sometimes associated with the idea of euthanasia and assisted suicide. This is compassionate killing. But no, real compassion means accompanying people, even through the darkest parts of their lives. And suffering is a fact of life. We have not found a way yet to eliminate it entirely. We found ways to eliminate some sufferings, like you just pop an Advil for a headache or whatever, and take some antibiotics for that, bacteria that's destroying you, that otherwise, would have given you a terrible death in the Middle Ages. But despite all our advances, guess what? You're still gonna suffer. And life can be a blank sometimes. Insert your word of choice. But seriously, I'm not here to try to minimize suffering at all. Quite the opposite. But I'm just saying that it's gonna happen. And so our question is not how might we eliminate suffering, but how might we choose to respond to it? And we can give up, and we can say, you know what, I can't do anything for you, but kill you. Eliminate the sufferer to eliminate the suffering. Or we can persevere, and we can say, we might not have a cure right now, and I might not know how to help you, but I'm going to be with you. And learning compassion is essential to our humanity. If we didn't suffer, we might very well be very apathetic. That was Jesus's end as well, immense suffering. And those of us who are Christians believe that suffering can be redemptive, actually. That does not make it easy, but that we can find meaning in suffering as well. So again, you can give me terrible cases, and I'm going to agree with you that they're terrible, and I feel so badly for that individual suffering. But our job then is to step up and try to be there for the person and not to eliminate them. Viktor Frankl was a Holocaust survivor, and he wrote a book, Man's Search for Meaning. And one of the things he was wondering was, why is it that some prisoners in concentration camps chose to run into the electric fences around them and kill themselves? And what is it that motivates those who decided to go on, despite the horror that surrounded them every single day? And he developed this formula, which is despair is suffering without or minus meaning. And so to prevent ourselves from despairing, we must find meaning, even despite our sufferings. And again, those of us who are Christians believe that we were created with love for love. That is the meaning in our life. And it doesn't matter what grievous and irremediable medical condition you have, you can still find meaning in your life. You can still love and be loved, which is what, again, we were all made for, regardless of whether we're able-bodied or not. And so that should be our source of hope. The idea that no matter what happens to our life always has meaning in it. And that's to continue on, we need to find it. So the other possibility could be that maybe it's not so much suffering, but it's wrong to kill innocent human beings unless they want to be killed. That denying someone euthanasia and assisted suicide is restricting their liberty in unjustified ways, and that this is just a decision that they make because they have their own autonomy on this. To which I have to point out, like, unless you permit everyone and anyone access to euthanasia and assisted suicide, I mean, this is not really about liberty and autonomy then. Because, again, you can have an able-bodied, healthy person who still just chooses to die. Are you going to give them access to assisted suicide and euthanasia as well? Because that's going to lead to a very worrisome society where, again, it's death on demand for everyone and all. I don't want to see what that world would look like. But I guess the alternative to that is also, I mean, besides just banning assisted suicide and euthanasia, is drawing lines that are going to communicate a deadly ableism or ageism, which we'll talk about in a moment. But also, if we're doing this on the basis of liberty and autonomy, why limit euthanasia and assisted suicide to the healthcare field? And why do we insist upon physicians and healthcare professionals like nurse practitioners carrying it out? I know we want like an air of like respectability to this, but if someone doesn't, if they're just like, hey, I want my best friend Joe to do it, like, why not? If this is all about liberty and autonomy, why not open up the law to dueling? Like, let two guys like stand out on the street with guns, just like the Wild West, and kill each other. If this is about liberty and autonomy and all that, and then of course we're going to allow dueling, then like what sense does it make to require people to like wear seatbelts in the car and stuff like that? Like, theoretically, we should just be like, yeah, like freedom for all. Like, if you want to choose to kill yourself, fine. Again, I don't think that this makes for a desirable society. As I was talking about, euthanasia and assisted suicide are like the definition of ableism and ageism. And I took this from Bill C-7's preamble, whereas Parliament affirms the inherent and equal value of every person's life and the importance of taking a human rights-based approach to disability inclusion, blah, blah, blah. And it's just talk. It's just talk because in some cases, society rejects an individual's assessment that their life is not worth living. Guess what? If I try to apply for euthanasia and assisted suicide right now, and I'm like, I've had it, I'm done, the government is not going to say yes. Even if I've assessed that my life is not worth living, they disagree. Whereas if I had disability that was deemed a grievous and irremediable medical condition, if I wasn't able-bodied, especially if Bill C-7 passes, they could be like, yes, I agree with your assessment that your life isn't worth living. So euthanasia and assisted suicide proponents will try to make this seem like this is just about respecting individuals' choice if they're having too difficult a time. But no, there's absolutely a societal element where we're choosing whether or not to agree with that individual's assessment of their circumstance. And this is something, one of the CLC youth graphics that we have in our social media pointing out that those who are able-bodied get suicide prevention, and those who are not get suicide assistance. And someone might ask, like, what does it matter if the patient's dying anyway? Like, they're gonna die a week from now. Like, what does it matter if I just kill them now? But just one day with a loved one is so meaningful. Like, if you've ever lost someone in your life, a grandparent or parent, God forbid, or a sibling, most people would give anything for an extra day with them. And that should be our response. Like, if a friend is dying from cancer, like, we shouldn't be like, they're gonna be dead soon anyway. Like, no need to like visit them. No, of course not. We would fly across the country just to see them and be with them in their last days. And like, that's all of life. Like, if one day doesn't mean anything, then like, what is 2 days? What's 3 days or whatever? Like, our life is meaningful because each day that our life is composed of is meaningful. And also, the prohibition against killing innocent human beings is a powerful one. And I don't think we should dismiss it so easily. Again, the distinction between letting and die and killing here. A lot of these ideas that I was talking about are ones communicated by Stephanie Gray, generally known for her abortion apologetics, but she also does talks on assisted suicide as well. Her website is Love Unleashes Life. She has some beautiful insights. And then also Blaise Ellen and Jonathan Van Maren have a guide to discussing assisted suicide, and that's very practical for having one-on-one conversations with people. So I'd recommend checking those out. I also want to point out that, obviously indirectly, we're all affected when life is devalued. We're affected by the abortion issue too, the idea that life could be disposable instead of viewing life in such high regard that life can never be taken. It's also going to significantly impact our healthcare system. It's already doing so. There's a case in Newfoundland, Candace Lewis, who had a disability, and she was in the hospital, and doctor suggested within earshot of her to her mother euthanasia, and Candace heard that, and no one wants to think why would you suggest that for me? It's also happened to Roger Foley, who was in London, Ontario, and he wanted the ability to construct his own care team so he could live at home. But instead, multiple times, people were suggesting euthanasia and assisted suicide to him. And then there's a disincentive to actually being accountable and improving our healthcare system if euthanasia and assisted suicide is viewed as the default, the solution here. But also, I want to point out something, and I think it's really transformational to our thinking when realizing that you could personally have been aborted because you were an embryo in the womb one time. Your life began at fertilization. And so likewise, I think it's really eye-opening to realize that one day you might want to die. I hope not, but one day you might. And our job right now is to convince society that if we ever get to that point, that they say no and not yes. Because a lot of people, again, will attempt suicide, and those who survive admit, you know what, I regretted it the moment I stepped off the bridge or whatever. We're all going to have bad days, and we just hope to get through them. And this is not to say that the issue only matters because it could impact you. Of course, it matters just because it could impact others, but I want to personalize this. And there's a choice here. That was the title of my webinar in the first place. When is life no longer worth living? But is there such a thing as life unworthy of life? And if you recognize where that comes from, it comes from Nazi Germany, who believes in there being life unworthy of life. And our answer should be no, that there is no such thing as life or human life unworthy of life. And that it's a choice because there's an instrumental or inherent value of life. If we have an instrumental value of life, then you're only useful to society when you can do certain things, whatever. Then your answer is going to be, yes, there is such a thing as life unworthy of life. But as pro-lifers, we believe that our values inherent, that it's intrinsic. It cannot be taken away. It's rooted in our humanness, which again, we're still human even when we're suffering in our end stages, even when we have a crippling disability. And so, especially if again, we're Christians and we believe that we're all made in the image and likeness of God, our value cannot be taken away. And so there is no such thing as life unworthy of life. And also, there's an ethics question here. If you believe that we're just here for pleasure, then there could be a situation where The amount of pain in your life outweighs the pleasure you get from continuing to live. And then in this utilitarian calculus, you think, yeah, maybe it's better off that I be dead. But if we believe that there are absolute rights and wrongs, be it some deontological Kantian ethic or natural law given to us by God or whatever, again, we think that there's some things that are just wrong to do, like it is wrong to kill an innocent human being. So to be clear, this is not simply a choice of, is it all right to euthanize this person or not? This is a choice of what philosophy do we want to adopt as a society? Do we want to buy into the concept of something like life unworthy of life? Let's be clear about the significance of the choice here. And I really like this quote from this English journalist, Malcolm Muggeridge. He said, "This life in us, however low it flickers or fiercely burns, is still a divine flame which no man dare presume to put out. Be his motives never so humane and enlightened, to suppose otherwise is to countenance a death wish. Either life is always and in all circumstances sacred, or intrinsically of no account. It is inconceivable that it should be in some cases the one, and in some the other." And as he said, sometimes our candle isn't burning very brightly, but society should never try to blow it out at all. So I just wanted to include that because I think it's a very nice quote. So you might be wondering, what can I do? Spend time with the elderly and disabled individuals in your life, those who are most vulnerable to having a bad day. Advocate for better palliative care. As I mentioned, over 2/3 of Canadians currently don't have access to palliative care when they need it. And for decades now, various bodies have been saying we need to improve our palliative care system, and guess what? Hasn't happened. And just recently there was that big expose over the state of the long-term care homes in Ontario, at least. Might have been across country. Our system needs to do better. Palliative care is about providing all the necessary care, like spiritual, emotional, relational, physical, and otherwise, in the last days of one's life, which is so necessary. And if you have good palliative care, the last days of your life can be like amazing, transformative. That sounds weird, but you reconnect with like people you were not able or chose not to connect with earlier in your life. And like that's the final chapter. That's when you like finish up your business and say goodbye world. And that's the thing that's being cut short here. Advocate for conscience rights, because those are under attack as well in terms of physicians and healthcare professionals like nurses who don't want to be involved in this. Their rights are not being fully respected, even though they were supposed to be, according to Carter v. Canada. The Delta Hospice Society is one example. They're in BC, and they're being compelled to provide euthanasia, even though there's a hospital literally right next door to their hospice that provides euthanasia. So that there's information on that on Campaign Life's website. Please look into that. Educate others about this, because popular opinion is actually against us on this one. But it's often because people aren't aware of what the arguments are on this. And the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition has a list of resources if you want to look into other things like power of attorney and whatnot to protect yourself and your loved ones. Of course, Campaign Life Coalition's big thing is lobbying your MP. We are a political organization. If you go to the homepage of our website, you'll see on the right there is a button for petitions and a button for action alert emails. So I definitely encourage you to sign our petition on Bill C7. You'll also see that they have an option to send a postcard to your MP, asking them to oppose Bill C7 as well. And our action alert email campaign allows you to send an email to your MP. It also comes with a pre-written message, so you don't even have to put the work into it. These are like super easy, low effort initiatives that I would encourage you to do. Also on the home page, there's the option to find your elected representative by just putting in your postal code, and it'll come up with your federal and provincial representative. So if you click on your federal representative, there'll be a tab for contact info. So set up with a meeting with them. It might be difficult with COVID-19, but you can also just call them and lobby them directly. CLC Youth has talking points you can mention. This is one such example of a social media post with points you can mention in a conversation with them. But you don't have to know everything on the topic in order to mention this, because guess what? Your MP doesn't either. It's remarkable how little they'll know about Bill C7 and the euthanasia issue in general. And it might not necessarily convince them, but it's always valuable to try, especially if we all try. And as I pointed out earlier, even euthanasia advocates realize that there's serious problems with this bill, and we just need to make our members of parliament aware of those problems and urge them to vote against it.